Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of Book Bites. It's been a fantastic literary month so far, and I'm very pleased to welcome today Terry Angelos. She'll be talking about her very courageous, beautifully written novel, White Trash. And just to introduce, Terry Angelos is a Durban-based visual artist and writer. She lives in Durban, as I said, is married to her soulmate. I think that's a beautiful way to put it. Has 3 grown-up children and a pug called Juniper, named after her favorite drink. I wouldn't be too familiar. Welcome to the show, Terry. It's so wonderful to have this opportunity to chat to you this evening.
It's wonderful to be with you, Shafinaaz. And as we speak, my pug Juniper is scratching on the door because I've just rushed in from a family trip and she hasn't seen me.
So you've been ignoring her. We better make this as quick as
Yeah,
possible so you can catch up on lost time. Congratulations on a beautifully written memoir. There's so
thank
many
you.
poetic paragraphs that I caught on, in so many beautiful ways of writing. And also, like, what does it take? Tell us about your writing process. What does it take to reach down, almost 2 decades back and be able to write in this way?
Well, thank you for the compliment from a fellow writer. And yeah, I think being a visual artist, I knew that that's something I could draw on was to draw on my own imagination and creativity. And I just looked at it almost like painting with words. That was my approach. And then, memoir is all about telling the truth. So I think the other thing that I was very aware of was the different ways of telling truth. And so I looked at telling not just the factual truth, the places and the people and the things, but looking for the emotional truth, the psychological truth. Yeah, kind of the different ways in which truth can be found. And sometimes can also be acknowledging where the truth is blurred, where memory is lost. That's all part of telling the truth, is to acknowledge those times of like disassociation or where memory has been lost and fragmented.
It's interesting when you say that because we often talk about writing as a form of healing and writing
Mm,
as a way of reaching back also for self-forgiveness, if anything,
mm,
you know. And I think
absolutely.
firstly, I have to say it's very courageous. Writing fiction is sort of like the easy way out compared to when you write a memoir. I think it's a very courageous act
Oh,
because it
thank
takes
you.
such
I think
depth
fiction
in the
is so
writing.
brilliant because you have to make it all up. But
It's
yeah,
definitely an art, and it does take discipline, and it takes a lot of creativity. You're an artist, so you understand
yes.
so many perspectives around that. But what I'm saying is, memoir takes a different level of authenticity.
Mm,
It takes you being honest with yourself and holding that mirror up to yourself. And that's why I
yes.
love listening to memoir writers when they speak about process, because it doesn't just affect you; it affects everyone around you.
Yes, and I think it definitely does take a lot of courage. I know that that's something I really wrestled with, is just the risk involved, not just the stigma around sex work, but I think interwoven into the story is kind of, it's a coming of age story, but it's also a young girl coming of age in terms of her own identity and her racist culture, her racist upbringing. So there was also a lot of risk in telling that part of my story and in uncovering and sort of sharing the recovery and healing process of that as it intertwines with the other layers of coming of age and healing from all kinds of trauma.
What I admire is throughout the book, at various stages of your life, you're very adamant about living life on your own terms, and that's a very important sort of message for any
Mm,
reader out there, young or old. And at the same time, those leave maybe disappoint those around us. There's certain choices we make in life that might not go down well with loved
mm,
ones as well. But what I also found interesting is you speak about growing up in what was then Rhodesia and being socialized, the concept of white supremacy and the thinking and the ideology around that. And then in your memoir, you're constantly interrogating that. You probably still are from the way that you've written your acknowledgements and your final, your afterword, interrogating white supremacy and then living large in the world itself and working against all of those preconceived ideas of who the boogeyman is, who the terrorists are, what communists are. And so I admire your interrogation. Speak to us about some of that, unpacking some of that in your own consciousness.
Yeah, I think I was very determined in telling all parts of my story to put forward something very unsanitized and unguarded. And I think that's where it's quite risky, because it's very easy to write about these things and sound woke or sound politically correct, and then it can come across like you've almost excluded yourself from those prejudices and experiences. And I wanted it to unfold in the story all the levels at which I've had to face those things in myself and deal with them. And I think a lot of white people, they struggle with that because they think it makes them look like bad people, or evil people, instead of just acknowledging that you have a worldview and a world experience and a privilege that has skewed your experiences to be very different to that of others. And so it's kind of saying, listen, I'm going through life with a certain lens and with blind spots, and I will always have to be aware that I will sometimes be insensitive. I will sometimes minimize other people. I will sometimes just think my opinion is automatically the most important opinion in the room. So until you have that self-awareness, you can't actually deal with anything. That has to come first. And I think sometimes that's something people are afraid to look in the mirror and see the parts of themselves that are ugly and unlikable. And I think a lot of people think owning up to having had this experience, in this year overseas of being a call girl was the most difficult thing to own up to. And yes, there is shame in that, but I think a lot of times the shame comes through in owning up to the things about ourselves that are not likable, that are not politically correct, that are, for instance, owning up to being greedy, owning up to being manipulative. You know what I'm saying? Those are things that are uncomfortable to talk about. And I think that's where the vulnerability and the honesty that people have connected with in the story comes from, because we can all see ourselves. We all see, the not so likable parts about ourselves, whether we've done something as extreme as be a sex worker or not. Those things are part of what it means to be human, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Well, I mean, you talk about there are many choices that we make, and we put them under the label of survival or self-preservation as communities, and this affords us the unfortunate process of othering, you know, um, feeling better about ourselves because the other is lesser, whether that other means because of a choice of work or labor,
Yeah.
or whether it's, so there's scams that people try to pass off as good business ideas. There's all sorts of things that we grapple with as human beings, as human, and we constantly, that mirror is constantly put up in front of our faces. I especially enjoyed that you say, there's a line where you say, you talk about why you wrote the story, and this idea that stories build those bridges and create opportunities for empathy. But especially the line that stuck out for me was that when you say shame has no space when there's empathy, shame does not survive where there is empathy. And this is, for me, sums up reason for why this book is so important and why it should be read widely, because it creates that understanding. You made these choices. You always had the scent of adventure carrying you forward,
Yes.
and it puts you into difficult circumstances. I don't know how much of that was, positive or not, but I especially appreciate how it's catapulted you further on into life. Speak to us
Mm,
about this thing you call redemption. I use the word redemption very sort of carelessly, maybe, but speak to us about this process of
yes.
making your own choices and seeking redemption.
It's funny when I started to write this book, I definitely saw myself as 52, now 53. I definitely saw myself as a woman who's done a lot of spiritual work, a lot of healing. My worldview is a Christian worldview, and so that's the journey that my faith has taken me on. So, I didn't think the writing of this book was going to be, as the cliche is, cathartic and all of that. But what surprised me was that I was able to go, because I wrote very much in the present tense, and I wanted to take the reader right with me on all those stages of this adventure. I was able to be that 19-year-old girl again, that kind of teenage misfit. And so I think that allowed me to be a lot more compassionate, because I think when we look back as women, we can judge ourselves very harshly, but we're looking at ourselves through a very different lens. We're judging an 8-year-old child who feels shame for something some stranger did to her, but we're judging as a 35-year-old or a 45-year-old or a 60-year-old woman. And so I think that was really a very light bulb moment for me. It enabled me to be a lot more compassionate, a lot more kind towards myself, about my choices. And I think the process of putting it out there has been kind of liberating. It's hard to explain, but it's almost like it's now out of me. It's out in the world, and it can now be talked about, and it can help other people. And there can be so much conversation that allows compassion to be given to other people and received from other people. So I don't know if that makes sense. So there
There's
was,
something
yeah,
there's something heavy about a secret over the generations. I think it holds secrets hold trauma. Maybe not a secret as such, but just not being able to openly share in spaces that you don't feel safe. This is where the courageous part comes in.
yes. And look, I think it's very important when you say a safe place. And not everyone should do something as public as kind of this. Um, and I certainly had enough support from my husband, my children, my friends, my circle to feel safe about doing this. But I think it's the shame, really, the shame associated with those things, that I think is the heavy thing that we carry. It's not necessarily the act itself, because very often the shame we carry is shame for somebody else's action towards us, especially as women. Experiences of violence, of trauma, of rape, of um, you know, cultural experiences where we are minimized or we're not acknowledged. We tend to carry the shame for that, and feel the responsibility of that.
There's also, being socialized as good and virtuous, wanting to make your own decisions that go beyond those boundaries, even if it's for the space of a year, and believing strongly that you have agency, but then finding yourself in these very dangerous situations. So, sort of tumbling into this life in London of being a call girl as a teenager,
Yeah.
and yet finding sisterhood alongside the dangers. So, like we often talk about the exploitation of women in different forms of work. And this is a lengthier conversation, which we might not have really time for. But
Yes,
it
and
does
certainly
come
having
through.
just read one of your books, I see the thread of that theme throughout your writing as well. And I think the acknowledgement that exploitation of women, the kind of sex work scenario is quite an obvious, blatant kind of format in which we, sex trafficking into the sex industry, that kind of thing. But there's many layers in which a woman has, it's a place where she finds herself, where her economic safety is linked to her womanhood and her sexuality. I don't know if that makes sense. But for instance, like a single mother who's in an abusive relationship but feels unable to be on her own financially,
Yeah.
that kind of a thing. But yeah, I was a very, considered myself very worldly wise at the age of 19 and very capable of handling all these situations that I got myself into. And certainly in the beginning, I felt quite empowered by this, moving in these circles where there were very wealthy and very affluent and influential men around me. And I felt like I had power over them, and that I was the one calling the shots. So yeah, and just this lifestyle that just, on the surface seemed so glamorous and so empowering in a lot of ways. But I found that dynamic soon changed, and I found myself being the one disempowered and dehumanized over time. And I found myself way over my head for 19, 20 years old, South African girl in the city of London. Yeah.
You talk about sort of that turning point. Maybe it wasn't just an overnight turning point, but you have that sudden understanding that financial empowerment doesn't equate to your own safety, and your vulnerability is that turning point, realizing that your life is in danger. And I find it, something that I can identify with is that you rely on faith, your reconnection with God, your greater sense of spirituality, as a way of redeeming yourself. I really enjoyed when you wrote about, as in it's them being an incredible act of mercy. You say here, it feels as if God Himself is saying these words just for me to hear. He has heard my prayer. He knows I have no future and I have no hope. He knows I'm afraid of being harmed. He knows I'm looking for Him, searching for another way. I call and see God came running. I think the words you actually speak to was a verse in the Bible that one of your friends. I know the
Yes.
plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper and not to harm you, plans to give you a future. And what I found interesting about that is, we have a collection, in the traditions, the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where God says, if you take one step towards me, I will take 10 steps towards you. And if
Yes.
you walk
Yeah.
towards me, I will come running towards you. So that jumped out at me because it's something we've held on to as a means of, especially coming through the pandemic and various trying times, this reconnection with spirit, this sort of divine reconnection. I
Yeah.
thought that was so profound.
Yeah. And I think there was a sense in me, that I had brought grief. I don't know if it makes sense that I had brought grief to that part of myself, because I had not honored the sanctity of the sexual relationship. I had not kept something pure and honorable that should have been kept pure and honorable. It had become a transaction, and something where, to dehumanize not just me, but the person paying for that transaction. I also write in the book a lot about what that actual transaction involves to both parties. And so I think I think for me, all of the things that I think maybe some people find as just kind of religious words or religious phrases, redemption, it can grace, things can sound just like, hymns you sing on a Sunday, but those things became absolute truths for me. Things that were like, I clung to them with my life. And I think it was just that wholehearted belief in those things that pulled me through, because I honestly believed that I could be made new, that I could start over, that God did see me with love and grace, and that He did want something more for me. So, yeah, I think, and because I was quite cynical before about religion and Christianity and just faith in general, I didn't come at it with that cynicism. Somehow that all just melted away, and these things became truth that was life-saving. And it's, yeah. it's kept me some form of sanity for the rest of my journey in life. And I think
it's a
even the,
beautiful
yeah, I
it's a
think even the,
beautiful realization to have at the age of
mhm.
20.
Yes. And I think what also came into that fact was, I looked at my future and I thought I'd been kind of a risk taker and someone who clearly, when you read the book, was up for an adventure and up to try new things and do new things. So I think what happened was I got to the stage where I thought there's no newness left. And newness is, and the option to know there's still something to explore in life is precious. And all I could see was there's only more of the same. There's only more promiscuity. There's only more kind of glamour. There's only more drugs. There's only more crazy holidays and wild adventures. There's not anything new. There's nothing new left. It's only more of the same. And the only thing that I thought was not, that I'd not explored or exploited was actually faith and God. And that was the only thing that held anything left to explore, if that makes sense. And so that's what I actually thought. My future terrified me because I just thought I'd trashed it. I'd literally thrown it away, and there was nothing left to look forward to.
It does come through as a very strong sense of consciousness, because I think finding, divine connection is not necessarily just a happy coincidence.
Mm,
And it's it reads as quite a blessing to know that at 20, and having made such profound decisions for your life,
mm,
um, that that divine presence was always watching over you, and there was always that presence that eventually you were able to connect with.
yeah,
That's how
yeah.
it reads to me. It's not just sort of like, let's find the next cult and see what comes of it. It's not sort of just tumbling through life and seeing what happens.
Yeah.
There's this consciousness that you operate with. There's this, um, uh, and so it reads in a very sort of, what I would call, in a very spiritual way, and it doesn't
Mm.
necessarily have to, link to a specific, sort of religious ethos, so to speak.
Yeah,
But it
I think I
is.
really wanted it to not, this was never written as a Christian book or as a church book. I wanted the story to be widely read and for people to see a beautiful spiritual journey like you're talking about, and see the power of faith to change a life, and the power of really believing that you've been redeemed, that you've been rescued, because that's really what redeemed is. I mean, it was literally a word used for, when a slave was paid the price for their freedom, they were redeemed. And that money was paid, they were set free, and they no longer belonged to anybody else. They were free. So, I really wanted those concepts to come through and not just be kind of yeah, as I said, a churchy book. Because then again, all those words and phrases just have so much other stuff weighted to them. I wanted to try and write it in a very fresh, non-religious way.
Well, I certainly don't mind the religious reference. It's written in a way that is sort of very, it's obviously a very beautifully written book, but it's dignified and it's very relatable. It has that sort of, authentic transition through your life phases. Normally,
Mm,
we would have this conversation right in the beginning, but also I want to refer to the title,
mm,
and a somewhat uncomfortable title, but I like the way you unpack it, where you get to this point and there's almost like this sigh of relief,
mm,
this realization, because in the
mm,
back of the mind, part of the shame was holding on to this title. And when you say, I'm no longer white trash, it's more of
mm.
a, I found that you had that self, sort of, you put that label on yourself. And it's quite humbling to see when you say that.
Mm. I
Um,
did. I wrestled with this title, and it kind of came to me in a light bulb moment, because I wanted to kind of title and jacket this book very differently to what the typical kind of call girl memoir was, Confessions of a Call Girl, which kind of presents itself as something very titillating and you know, going to take you behind the scenes to all the, and I knew that there was a lot more layers and depth to the story. So I like the fact that's just, it's such a gut punch of a title, and I think it's something that, you know, when I felt my most kind of broken and defeated, and where, you know, all the social constructs, all the layers, all the personas that I had built up in myself in this world of manipulation and kind of, I call it being a shapeshifter, that when all of those things fell down, you know, that's what I felt like. I felt worthless and felt like nothing, something to be discarded, something that has no value. And I always find it also quite, you know, ironical that there's so much stigma around this kind of slur to white people, whereas because it actually this term came about when white, well, there's kind of mixed roots, but one of us that was, you know, people that associated with non-white people were called white trash because of their associations. Over time, it's come to mean different things. So, yeah, but it was difficult. There are times like, oh, you know, have I really pushed the boat out too far this time? But yeah, I think I've been very happy with it, and I like the discomfort. I like the discomfort it causes me, and I like the discomfort it causes other people. I like the conversation it brings up.
And I think that there's no doubt that it will continue to bring up conversations. This is exactly what you want. For
Mm,
people to be reading and engaging the material, not just be entertained by what they read or
mm,
just sort of process it as another book to read.
mm.
Terry, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. Congratulations again on a brilliant,
Oh,
brilliant memoir, on a beautifully written memoir.
thank
And
you.
I know that it will be widely read, and conversations will be running over the rest of this year on your fabulous work.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely chatting with you, and yeah, especially chatting to such an accomplished author as yourself. And yeah, I really appreciate the time to have this conversation with you.
Once again, I wish you everything of the best with this book, and I hope we meet soon so that we can have lots of literary chats once again.
I'm sure we will. I hope so too.
Have a wonderful weekend, or what's left of it,
Thank
and
you.
best wishes to you.
Perfect. Thank you.